Glaives. If you want to delete entire rooms in Warframe, then there's hardly a better weapon type. But if you're wondering which one of these diabolical discs of doom is the very best, then oh boy do I have you covered. Because today, we're gonna go over all the glaives in Warframe with builds and everything in search of the ultimate number one. As always, big shoutouts to all our generous channel members, and now, let's play a bit of Frisbee. Now, in the very unlikely case that you've never put your greedy little fingers onto a glaive in the game, let's quickly go over some of the basics that you need to know. Glaives are one type of melee weapons in Warframe, but compared to most other melees, they are round. Which means, yes, you can theoretically use them like any other melee in the game and bash them into the enemy's head until they stop existing. However, that is hella cringe, and if you actually enjoy that, then please don't come to my funeral. Nope, what we do with these things is hold the melee button because that allows you to throw them, and then either you let them bounce between enemies, eventually returning back to you, or when they're mid-air, then you can press the heavy attack button to make them go kablooey into the enemy's face. 9 out of 10 Grenier do not like this experience. In terms of stance mods, glaives have access to 2 different ones, which completely don't matter because the throw is exactly the same on both, and that's realistically the only thing we're ever gonna do. However, one thing that is important with glaives is the combo multiplier, because those throws that we explode mid-air count as heavy attacks, and therefore they scale multiplicatively with your combo multiplier. Or, in other words, if you have a combo multiplier of, let's say, 6x, then your mid-air explosion is gonna deal 6 times the usual damage. Now, before we jump into the entire glaive and builds list, I want to give you some general build tips that usually hold up for most glaives across the board. In case you want to cook up your own personal build, these would be some good overall guidelines. Tip number 1. When you build a glaive, you're usually looking for mods that increase your initial combo, like for example Corrupt Charge or Galvanized Reflex, but also Ready Steel, the Warframe Aura mod, does the same thing, and what that does is, instead of going down to 0 combo multiplier after a heavy attack, you generate a minimum combo multiplier under which you can never fall, and therefore your glaive explosions will always deal high damage. Next, the most important thing in my opinion to mention when building any glaive in the game is the most boring upgrade in the entire game, Melee Influence. Just in case you've never heard about it, what Melee Influence does is, elemental status types on your melee weapon, so only the elements and not the physical impact puncture / ones, will be spread in a 20-meter radius. Now, the reason why that is so incredibly strong on glaive-type weapons is because the initial explosion of the glaive already has an AoE. It is theoretically possible, if there is electricity on your glaive, that this initial explosion, every enemy in the radius, will trigger the melee influence effect, meaning that every enemy in the initial AoE will create their own AoE in which they spread the status effect to all the other enemies, leading to a sort of quadratic scaling, which allows you to instantly blow up larger grouped up contingents of enemies. This single mechanic is the most important thing to keep in mind for the rest of the video, as we're going to use that on pretty much every single glaive. Another general tip for glaives would be, since their throws are considered heavy attacks, go for anything with heavy attack wind-up speed, like Killing Blow and Amalgam Organ Shatter, and on most glaives you also want to use the mod Volatile Quick Return, because this increases the blast radius on the explosion, meaning you hit more enemies. Next, another very important mod with thrown melee weapons that I want to talk about here would be Power Throw, because this makes it that when you chain together your glaive throws, you get an increasing damage bonus, which is multiplicative to base damage, meaning it is very strong. However, what you need to keep in mind with Power Throw is, in order for this stacking to actually work, you need to throw out the glaive, make it explode, and then when it returns back to you, you're gonna make sure that you're holding down the melee button in order for the animation to chain into the second melee throw, otherwise the damage bonus from Power Throw will not go up. Now, to be honest, I personally just do not like that type of gameplay. It's not my cup of tea, which is why I never use Power Throw on any of my builds. I just want to say that it is theoretically a very strong option, and you should at least give it a try and see if you want to incorporate that into your personal builds. And now, before we jump into the list, one last tip that I gotta give, and big shout out goes out to WarframeFlo because I actually saw that in his video on the Glaives back in the day. You can use Glaives as a support weapon for secondaries because you can equip the mods Combo Fury and Mark of the Beast on Glaives. Combo Fury giving you a lot of reload speed and magazine capacity on secondary weapons, and Mark of the Beast coming in with a fat status and crit chance bonus. If you're cooking up a build where you're primarily using a secondary weapon, like for example on Yareli, then equipping a glaive with those two mods just to buff up your pistol is a pretty good idea. And now, like the video or all your glaives are gonna turn into Britney Spears albums. Believe me, you don't want that. Cheers so much for your support. But with all that being said, let's now take a look at all the glaives in Warframe, starting out with a bit of a cringe part as always. Big disclaimer here because otherwise you're just gonna annihilate me in the comments. I know you. The overwhelming majority of builds showcased in this video will be general builds, where the weapon is going to perform on its own without specific synergies. If a specific synergy is required to make the build work, then I'm going to specifically state that. Also, when I rank those glaives, there are personal viewpoints and preferences involved. And now, let's get right to it. Okay, jokes aside for a second. When I initially said we're going to talk about all glaives in the game, I was not exactly honest, because I decided that the glaive, the kestrel, the helicar, and the pathocyst will not be included on the list, and you're not going to get any builds on them. Why is that? Because those glaives are objectively not worth investing into, and I would not suggest any of you investing Forma or Catalysts into them, because the other glaives in the game objectively outmatch them. For the glaive, for example, we have the Glaive Prime, which is the same weapon, just objectively better. The kestrel is complete crap and just mastery fodder. The helicar has the Helicar Wraith, and since the Techrodon Core update, which brought the infested liches, also the base Pathocyst now has a better version, that being the Coda Pathocyst, so I decided to also leave out the Pathocyst and only talk about the Coda variant. But alright, the first glaive on today's list that I want to talk about would be the Orvius, that is Teshin's signature glaive, which already puts it in S tier for all the aura that you gain when wielding it. But then again, on the other hand, Teshin is dead, and that's probably because his weapon sucked. No, but like, in all seriousness, the Orvius is not necessarily the best glaive under the sun, and I would not necessarily recommend investing all too much into it. In terms of stats for the Heavy Throw Explosion, we're looking at some pretty balanced crit and status performance, with a nice little detail on the side being that the explosion deals pure cold damage, so you can actually freeze enemies with that. However, the base explosion radius of only 4 meters is pretty bad, and then also the cold gets a bit in the way. If we want to build for melee influence, that means we need electricity, and if we put electricity on the Orvius, it will combine with the cold into magnetic, so you can't even really trigger melee influence without having to go miles out of your way. Overall, I'm just not really a big fan. Now, the Orvius does have a little unique trait, which is if you prematurely release the throw button, it will lift a single enemy up in the air for a couple of seconds. Question being, does it trigger melee afflictions? Nope. So we can completely forget about that. It's a kind of a useless feature if you ask me. Enlighten me in the comment if I'm glazing over it and there's actually a use case for it, but I think this year it will not turn any heads. Now, in terms of builds, I only have one build prepared because, in all honesty, I think this is the only build that you can actually get some decent steel path performance out of, and that is, guess what, a typical melee influence build. However, because of the cold which gets in the way when going for melee influence, this build right here specifically needs you to play Volt with the Shock Trooper augment, because what this does is, it infuses electricity on your weapons, but in a way where it doesn't combine with the elements that are already present on the weapon. This then means that you have electricity and cold separately on the Orvius, allowing you to trigger melee influence, but overall I still think it's a pretty bad glaive. However, if you want to have it for yourself, then you obtain it from finishing the War Within quest. Next, let's talk about the Helicar Wraith. This one, if you want to have it, can be obtained from Borrow-Kitir whenever he happens to have that in his inventory, and if he doesn't bring it, then unfortunately the only thing you could do is buy it from another player. In terms of stats, we have a pretty status-focused performance, which is nice. However, the sad thing here is that on the heavy attack explosion, we're only going to deal blast damage, which isn't necessarily the most special thing to have on a glaive. In addition to that, also the Helica Wraith, just like the Orvius, has a unique trait, which makes it that you have a 50% chance to disarm enemies when you throw it at them. Yeah, I don't know about you, but where I come from, this is also not too amazing, because you know what's another great way to disarm an enemy? Exactly, just blow them to pieces right away. So let's take a look at which build you could use on the Helica Wraith to make that happen. And what can I say? It is the same build. We put electricity onto it to be able to trigger melee influence, which allows us to deal AoE electricity damage to all the enemies around us. Also with the Helica Wraith, I'm not the biggest fan of it because it does exactly the same thing that the other glaives on today's list will do, just that those do it better. We just had two relatively underwhelming weapons. Let's now talk about the best glaive in the game, at least a couple of years ago. I'm talking about the Glaive Prime. This glaive, my god, it is so iconic. I even made a video on specifically it around about a year ago, believing it was the greatest thing ever, but oh boy, how the turntables. See, when we're looking at the Glaive Prime, the stats don't look all too special. We have solid crit, status performance, and also the damage is pretty good. But what has made the Glaive Prime so special is that it force proc slash on every enemy hit by the heavy attack explosion. Back in the day, when you were going up against heavily armored Grineer, this made the glaive your lord and savior because the bleed effects from slash procs ignore armor entirely and are therefore very good against heavily armored targets. However, since the enemy health rework that capped enemy armor scaling and gave them a lot more health, this slash damage over time approach, well, it still works, but it is not the ultimate meta anymore, which unfortunately means the Glaive Prime fell off hard and nobody nowadays really uses it anymore as this slash force procer. Instead, what we do is exactly the same thing as on the Helica Wraith, put electricity on it to trigger melee influence and then use it as an electricity melee influence glaive like everything else in the game. If you ask me, that's kinda sad because it diminishes the one distinguishing factor that it had, that being the force proc slashes. However, I gotta say, because you have slash and electricity now, you're having two damage over time effects, which means that the overall numbers you're dealing with the glaive this way are still much better than what the previous two ones can put out. Just keep in mind that melee influence can only spread elemental status effects, so the force proc slashes unfortunately get not thrown around by it in the entire room. However, because the glaive was so iconic with its force proc slashes, I have prepared a second build. This one right here does not use melee influence, but therefore goes for melee duplicate and focuses purely on this retro playstyle of slashing the enemy, which can still be pretty fun against highly armored targets. And if you now want to get the Glaive Prime for yourself, then I think it is vaulted at the moment because it is part of the Ember Prime access, so depending on when you watch this video, you might have to go and buy the parts for it from other players. Now, let's next talk about a very strong contender for the best glaive in the game, and that would be the one and only Xoris. If there's only one thing you take away from this video, then it should be, please, for the love of the Lotus, do not sell this thing. You get it from playing the Deadlock Protocol quest, which means it is accessible very early on in the game and it is super strong. However, if you sell it off, then you're gonna have to grind your eyes out for ages to reacquire it. It's not pretty, and you can believe me because this thumbnail right here got me over 1 million views and made a whole lot of people hate themselves. So yeah, long story short, get the Xoris, but keep it. Now, in terms of stats, it doesn't look all too special with some balanced crit and status performance. However, what makes the Xoris the possibly best glaive in Warframe is that it not only has electricity damage on the explosion, but it also force procs electricity on this heavy explosion regardless of what else you modded onto the weapon. This makes it absolutely perfect for the aforementioned melee influence build, and what's even better on top is, it has a crazy high blast radius of 9 meters, which is the highest in the game, and because we're using volatile quick return, that increases it even further to 12 meters. Now, to be 100% transparent here, it does also have a unique trait that if you use normal attacks by punching it onto the enemy, you have infinite combo duration. However, when you do a heavy throw and detonate it midair, that's gonna reset regardless, so there's not really much use in it. Now, for all the glaives so far, I've only really showcased higher level builds. However, given the fact that you can obtain the Xoris so early in the game, I also want to give you a lower investment build for all those of you who just got their hands on the Xoris. This right here will be it. Just throw it into the enemies, detonate it, and see everybody melt away. You're gonna love it, but one warning here, this playstyle can get very boring very soon. So yeah, super duper strong, definitely invest into it. It was objectively the best glaive in Warframe till not too long ago. However, recently there have emerged some contenders, so let's go on in our list and see if it can maintain its first place. Now, so far, basically every glaive had the same build. Go for electricity and then melee influence to AoE nuke everything. However, now I want to talk about a glaive that actually works differently, and that would be the Falcor. At first glance, the Falcor looks pretty much exactly like the Xoris, and when we take a peekaboo at the stats, then this impression seems to be confirmed, because also the Falcor deals pure electricity on the detonation, and it also, just like the Xoris, force procs electricity. However, what sets the Falcor apart from every other glaive in the game is that it not only force procs electricity on the big explosion, but also, if you let it bounce between enemies naturally without exploding it yourself, then those bounce explosions that it triggers on every enemy, those also force proc electricity, and they have a healthy 6-meter radius. Now, what does that mean? This means that with the Falcor, instead of throwing the glaive out and then exploding it manually midair, we throw it into the enemies, it even has a little homing function to make sure that it actually hits something, and just let it bounce between them, because on every bounce, it triggers a 6-meter explosion, force proccing electricity on the enemy it hits and on everybody in the explosion radius, which means if the enemies are tightly grouped up, then this quadratic melee influence stacking that I previously talked about happens to an even crazier extent than with the Xoris. Now, this right here would be a standard melee influence build for this specific Falcor playstyle. Most important change here is that we don't use volatile quick return, as it would disable the bouncing, but therefore go with volatile rebound, which enables this constant explosion on bounces, and also, due to the fact that we're not manually detonating the glaive midair, our combo multiplier is not gonna reset, so with the Falcor, we're gonna stay at a constant 12x combo multiplier, allowing us to get a ton of crit and status chance from Blood Rush and Weeping Wounds, which isn't really viable on other glaives, as the constant midair explosions always reset your combo. Now, if you want to hear my personal suggestion, then that would be to play the Falcor ideally in combination with Kullervo, because Kullervo can give you a whole lot of crit chance for your melee, and when we're taking a look at the stats, then what we see here is that specifically the crit performance of the Falcor is really not all that amazing. So go ahead and use Kullervo to make up for this one weakness that it has, and you're gonna have some absolutely crazy performance. By the way, this purely electricity-focused melee influence build that I showed here is not the only thing you can do on the Falcor. I've actually seen a ton of other creative builds incorporating corrosive or blast, so feel free to experiment around a bit and see what you personally can cook up here. If you want to, you can also leave your favorite Falcor build in the comments down below. Oh yeah, and if you want to get it for yourself, then you can obtain it from the Energy Lab in your clan's dojo. If you don't like Corpus, then the next glaive will be the perfect fit for you, because Corpus surely don't like it. What I'm talking about here is, of course, the Serrata. Now, the Serrata is in a bit of an interesting spot, because for the longest time, it has always been praised for being the highest damage glaive in the game. And not just that, also the crit and status performance are pretty neat, plus it always force procs Toxin on heavy attack explosion, regardless of what you mod onto it. What this means is, Players usually use the Serrata against Corpus, as Toxin bypasses their shields, and because the Serrata always force procs Toxin regardless, that meant you had the very rare combination of Viral plus Toxin, which was the ultimate Corpus killer. Now, why am I talking in the past tense? Because with the release of Techrodon Core, we got a new glaive, about which we're going to talk in a minute here, that not only dethrones the Serrata as the highest base damage glaive by a long shot, but also allows for this very Viral plus Toxin playstyle that the Serrata was famous for. In other words, it basically does exactly the same thing that the Serrata does, just better. Now, what does that mean for the Serrata? I personally think it is still a very strong glaive. It has high damage and it is very good specifically against Corpus. However, I'm not 100% sure if I can still recommend investing a lot of resources into it. So, the build that I decided to showcase in this video is another Volt synergy, where we go for Volt with his Shock Trooper augment to be able to infuse isolated electricity onto the Serrata. That will then allow us to trigger melee influence and play a Toxin plus electricity melee influence build. Still very good against Corpus, but for that Viral Toxin, I would rather use the next one, which would be the Coda Pathocyst. Oh boy, just look at those stats. We have a decent crit chance with a high 2.5 times crit multiplier, a whopping 38% status chance, and it deals significantly more damage on the heavy attack explosion than the previously highest damage glaive, the Serrata, and all of what you're seeing on screen here is without the Lich typical progenitor bonus element that will be added on top of all the damage figures that you see here. So in reality, we're closer to dealing double the damage of the Serrata. Also, one special thing with the Coda Pathocyst, on heavy attack explosion, it not only deals pure viral damage, but it force procs viral, and because of the fact that it is a Lich weapon, it gets an additional progenitor element, giving you great build versatility. If you wanted to recreate that Serrata-specific Viral plus Toxin playstyle, then you could go for a Toxin progenitor. However, I personally would recommend going for Electricity to be able to trigger melee influence, because now you're not only dealing big amounts of AoE electricity damage, like with the Xoris, but you're spreading Viral at the same time. It's incredibly strong. Finally, the Coda Pathocyst also has a unique trait that spawns little maggots on the field that will attack enemies. Not really all that strong in the damage department, but they do cause a little bit of enemy distraction, which is greatly appreciated, and they too, if they hit, apply viral to the enemy. In terms of builds, I actually have 3 very different ones prepared for you. The first one is the standard big explosion melee influence build, like with the Xoris. However, you can also play the Coda Pathocyst like the Falcor, where you don't explode it manually, but you throw it out and let it bounce between the enemies. This is actually my personal favorite build here, and I might even like it a bit more than the Falcor, because here you have Viral as an additional element in the mix, plus the base stats are also much better than on the Falcor. And then finally, the third build uses a specific synergy where you have to use Zata's Whisper from Zaku and mod the Coda Pathocyst into Blast, because as we all know, if you combine Zata's Whisper with Blast, that is ridiculously strong. As you can also see in the background right here, the damage numbers are crazy and you explode the entire room. I think the Coda Pathocyst is a valid competitor for the Xoris. Alright, these would be my thoughts and builds on all the glaives in the game. However, before we end the video, I promised you a ranking, so let's put them all together in a quick tier list. First of all, in the D tier, D as in don't use them, would be the normal glaive, the Kestrel, the Helicar, and the normal Pathocyst, as it is now outclassed by the Coda one. In the C tier, C standing for cringe, we're gonna put the Orvius and the Helicar Wraith. They're not completely terrible, but I still would recommend saving up your resources for some other glaives. B tier stands for boobs are still nicer, and we're gonna put the Glaive Prime and the Serrata into it. They're both very solid, but due to the fact that melee influence is the unshakable meta for glaives, the best builds on both of them is, making them cosplay as inferior Xorises. And specifically in case of the Serrata, it is a good high damage glaive against Corpus, but as I just said, the Coda Pathocyst does exactly the same job now, just much better. A tier standing for awesome, and this was really difficult for me, but I decided to put the Falcor into here as it is really strong, and I like the fact that it's unique in the sense that you play it a bit differently than most other glaives by throwing it and letting it bounce. To me, that just feels very rewarding to play. Reason I don't put it in S tier is that it has pretty bad crit characteristics and it does need a good dose of Kullervo to make up for this, which naturally means in S tier, and might I remind you, this is my own opinion, you're free to disagree. I'm gonna put first of all the Xoris, because it force procs electricity, which is perfect for melee influence, and because it combines that with a ginormous radius. And then I also decided to put the Coda Pathocyst into S tier. It doesn't have that much of a radius compared to the Xoris, but it makes up for that with absolutely beastly stats and all the potential versatility in builds that you gain by being able to switch the progenitor element. And if you want to see a massively OP Mirage build that goes hand in hand specifically with the Falcor and the Coda Pathocyst, then you can find that right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lortel, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nos Linux Gaming, Turtlepeer, Ondakanio2, Skyla Bowser, Mihaki, Phil the Meme, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Morizaki, Shadow Lockhart, Trolloloxen, Hantares, Patrosator, Boomio1, Mr. Games Plays, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, if you don't know what a CD is, please get the heck out of my channel.